Hello, everybody. So this is my slideshow, which will go along with the lesson that we did on climbing my grandfather, so the live lesson. This is just in case we didn't get very far through the lesson, or you missed something, or we needed to discuss it more, but it wasn't possible in the live lesson. So these are all the things that I might have wanted to say, but obviously it doesn't make up for all of your ideas, but better than nothing. So as we would normally do in the lesson, we're going to start by talking about the connotations of the title. So the words in the title and what they might suggest to us, the things that they might make us think about when we're considering what the poem might be about, so before we read it. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to talk about are the connotations of the title. So on the following slides, the way that I set up the slides so that we could do it as a live lesson, so without the audio, because I'll have saved two separate versions. The way that the slides are working is that the different things that I want to talk about come in at different times. So I've attempted to put the audio, so there should be an audio symbol. So the audio symbol, which is in the top left-hand corner, that's a general overview or sort of instruction. And then the audio that goes with the particular words or phrases on the screen should be placed above it. Now, I hope that you're technologically better than me, because when I tried to play the slide, all the audio clips played at the same time, and it was like being in some kind of weird twilight zone. So I hope that doesn't happen for you and you can work out a way of playing them individually. Otherwise, it won't be so good. Right, I'm going to attempt, because these slides sort of the things that I want to talk about appear in order. I'm going to attempt to put in different audio slots so that you can hear what I want to say about the particular words after you've clicked to show them. I'm really not sure how that's going to work, but I'm going to experiment with it. The first word, obviously, that we've got to talk about is climbing. And the first thing I think about when I think about climbing, probably because this is me and I don't like climbing, is that it's upwards. And okay, so upwards can be a good thing. So if you've got an upwards trajectory, that could be seen as a real positive thing. It means you're going towards something positive, or you're aspiring towards something, and you're going in a positive direction towards it. Or it could be, well, for me it would be anyway, something that's difficult because it's strenuous. So just connected with the same idea with talking about climbing being positive. So climbing can be about a learning experience, or it could be about travel. So all of those positive associations with that. Also have negative associations, obviously. It's hard work. There's a lot of physical effort. There can also be emotional effort, depending what the climbing is a metaphor for. So a lot of effort and graft and things which mean that you have to invest quite a lot. But I suppose if you're investing quite a lot in something, it's often seen to be worthwhile anyway. The final thing that I would say about the word climbing is that it's in the present continuous tense. So what that's suggesting is that it's an ongoing experience. He hasn't climbed his grandfather. It's all done and dusted. It's finished and it's finished. He's climbing. He's going through that experience right now, possibly even taking the reader with him at the same time. So it's an ongoing experience. It's an ongoing effort. Right, so we're going to talk about the use of the word my. No, you'd think there'd be hardly anything to say about it, but obviously there is. We can say something about most things if we try hard enough. So if we were thinking about my, if you relate it back to before you were mine, we were talking about the possessive nature of the use of the repetitive use of the word mine. I don't think this is so possessive, but it is, potentially it's got that issue as well. So you could say this possessive, or maybe it's just descriptive, because it's saying this is about my grandfather, not your grandfather, my grandfather, this specific person. And I think that bit's quite important. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And here's the later comment. So we could just say it's really quite straightforward, and I've probably already implied it. The implication of my grandfather is that if you tried to replicate this experience with your own grandfather, it would be a very different experience, because that person would be different. So each person's experience would be different. My grandfather is different to your grandfather. So what we would learn would be entirely specific to our family history or the character of that person, whether they're, grumpy or cheerful or positive or negative. It would what we learned, the life lessons that we would gather from that person would be entirely specific to that person and to our personal experiences. So this is just one soundbite for the word grandfather. Obviously, it's potentially or arguably the most important word in the title, but not necessarily. I actually find that there's more to say about climbing. Anyway, so in terms of grandfather, the connotations that we have with the word grandfather are to do with age and seniority, position in the family, depending on the culture of the family concerned. A grandfather might have, great status. So in many cultures, grandparents would have huge significance, would be much admired and looked up to. In some other cultures, tucked away in the background. So it all depends on your cultural experiences in terms of how you automatically see a grandfather when you read that word. Now, a grandfather can be fragile, so there might be implications of fragility that kind of comes with age, but everybody will bring their own experiences of their own grandfathers. So, if your grandfather is sort of tough and solid, then that's what you'll bring to that word. So they can be feisty or fragile or stubborn or sweet. And again, we go back to that idea of, the poem is about climbing my grandfather for the poet. So it's each experience would be entirely individualized. Okay, so on this slide, we're going to read the poem through. So grab your anthologies, pause if you need to, go and grab a cup of tea. It's not that long. Actually, you don't need a cup of tea. I'm going to read it to you and you follow it through with me in your anthology, and then we'll start going through some of the key vocabulary and ideas in the poem after that. I decide to do it free, without a rope or net. First, the old brogues, dusty and cracked, an easy scramble onto his trousers, pushing into the weave, trying to get a grip. By the overhanging shirt I change direction, traverse along his belt to an earth-stained hand. The nails are splintered and give good purchase. The skin of his finger is smooth and thick like warm ice. On his arm I discover the glassy ridge of a scar, place my feet gently in the old stitches and move on. At his still firm shoulder I rest for a while in the shade, not looking down, for climbing has its dangers, then pull myself up the loose skin of his neck to a smiling mouth to drink among teeth. Refreshed, I cross the screed cheek to stare into his brown eyes, watch a pupil slowly open and close. Then up over the forehead, the wrinkles well spaced and easy, to his thick hair, soft and white at this altitude, reaching for the summit, where, gasping for breath, I can only lie watching clouds and birds circle, feeling his heat, knowing the slow pulse of his good heart. So, what are brogues? Brogues are shoes. If you look at the picture, they're exactly the type of shoe that you might want to start wearing. You might want to get some for September, just so that you're fully prepared. Everybody else was wearing school shoes that looked remarkably like trainers, but I decided to maintain standards with a lovely pair of brogues. I'm sure you know what weave is, but when I typed that in to get pictures, it actually came up with lots of pictures of hair. So it shows you how culturally our associations change over time. So, but this weave is about the construction of fabric. So with one thread being woven over another thread. So the first picture, the blue picture, that's just a real close up. It's a really heavy weave. So just shows you what we're talking about. But the other picture, the one on the right, that's much more like the kind of fabric that's in the poem. So because it's talking about the weave of the grandfather's clothing, so that would be a close weave, because if you were wearing something that was more like a sack, um, the one on the blue one, that would be really uncomfortable. So it's more like it's a soft fabric, but it's a very closely woven fabric. Okay, so traverse is just what it says on the slide. It just means to travel across or to journey. It's a great word, much better than travel. But you can see that it's got the same stem. So traverse, travel comes from the same origin. Being an excellent student, I traversed the one-way system regularly. Okay, so this could be a confusing one, because purchase, we would often think about buying something, but that's not what it means in this context. It means to have a really good grip on something. So, if you're climbing up something and it's loose, as in the example that I've given on the screen, you would want to get a good purchase with your shoes, or the grip on your boots, or with your fingers in crevices, to make sure that you don't fall to your doom. So of course you know what a ridge is, but just in case, there's a picture of one. But actually in the poem it's talking about the ridge of a scar, so it's talking about a raised scar, so the top bit of the scar. Right, so this is probably the most interesting one, I think, because I thought when I was reading the poem, and I actually thought it said scree, because scree would make sense, because scree, like the picture on the left is scree, and scree is that, loose rocks which kind of make, actually no, I think I was going to say it kind of makes the climb more difficult, because you could lose your footing, you might slip on it, because it's would move quite easily. So that is what immediately came to my into my mind when I read the word screed. But actually screed is the picture on the right. It's like it's a smooth concrete base in houses or buildings, which doesn't automatically make sense in the poem, because why would a mountain have a smooth surface, unless his grandfather does have a smooth surface on his cheeks, so his cheeks are smooth. So you have to work out whether you think he really means screed, as in his grandfather's cheeks are smooth, a smooth leveled surface, or whether his cheeks have been screed, as in made up of scree, or made scree. Oh, this doesn't make grammatical sense at all, but I think you probably know what I mean. So in other words, they've been made to be like scree over time, so they've become rough over time. So you have to think about which version of that you want to subscribe to, or a mixture of both, and then think about what that actually says about the grandfather. So here's just a couple of overviews of what the poem is about. So I don't know who said this, because I wrote it down in my anthology when I was first teaching it a few years ago, but they've said the poem splices together a description of his granddad with language associated with climbing a mountain. So the mountain becomes an extended metaphor for his grandfather. And the poem explores the idea of having a grip on something, a hold like you would need on a mountain. It gives you an understanding of who you are or where you've come from. His grandfather is represented as a solid he can lean on. So in other words, no, I think this is saying knowing something about your family background, the solid influences in your family tell you something about yourself, who you are, your family, how your family fits together, how your family fits into society, and the history of your culture, I suppose. So there's quite a lot to unpick in the ideas there. It's the imagery of the mountain is a really interesting one, because it's about a solid, firm, um, piece of geography, I suppose. Sorry, I was struggling for a word there. It's quite early in the morning for these times, anyway. So we're just going to talk about some of the key ideas in the poem over the next few slides. And the first thing that we're going to talk about are things which make the journey seem less secure. So why this journey up his grandfather might be less secure, and that might be something to do with the personality of the old man, that maybe he's not that welcoming, maybe things get in the way. It could be, we don't want to use supposition too much, because when we do that, we start to say all sorts of things might be the case when we've got no evidence for it. But whatever, there's something about this journey which doesn't make it always go easily, and that might be something to do with the personality of the old man, or it might be something to do with just the nature of making a hard physical climb. So whether you're looking at this metaphorically or literally, in terms of the literal climbing of a mountain. By the way, there's an interesting little game you can play on this slide. It's almost like a game of Where's Wally. You could play Spot the Unintentional, a Useless Additional Arrow. So the first dangerous seeming thing is the line, I decided to do it free without a rope or a net. So that's free climbing. It's talking about having no security. So if you fall, that's it. There's nothing to save you. And obviously that makes the journey seem perilous, more hazardous than obviously if you had a rope or a net, something to catch you. So he's taking a risk. The implication is that there's a risk being taken. So, it's a risky climb up a mountain, and he's saying, this looking into my grandfather and who my grandfather is also risky. Why? We don't know. Maybe he's going to find out something that he doesn't like. Again, we can't suppose too much, but certainly the implication of risk is there. There are also quite a few words which imply broken surfaces. So cracked, splintered, scar. Often these things, like certainly words like cracked, implies broken, but also they're and splinter. In fact, all three of those imply some kind of pain or disintegration. That disintegration could be something connected with age, I suppose, but also the idea that things aren't as perfect as they used to be. So it's cracked or it's scarred, but it also might be almost like war wounds, something that you can bear a scar and it's evidence that you've gone through something but you've survived. So you can see all of these things in a positive or a negative way, and therefore you've got to ask whether broken surfaces, if you're climbing up a mountain, or you're getting to know someone, are these surfaces, because they're broken, easier to hold on to? When we were talking about screed before, the smooth surface, that would be, if that was a mountain, if a mountain was that smooth, you're not going up it very easily. So it might actually make the journey much easier to have these broken surfaces. Then there's this image of warm ice. I can't decide whether it's positive or negative, so you're going to have to think and come to your own conclusion about that, because ice itself on a mountain, not so good, because it's not going to be, well, unless you've got spikes on your shoes, it's not going to be easy to climb up. And if the ice is to do with the grandfather, there's an implication of coldness. Perhaps he's not so easy to get to know. He's more of a difficult person. But then the ice is warm, and if the ice is warm, then possibly it's melting. So maybe the journey itself, the experience with his grandson trying to get to know him, is warming him up. And warm ice on a mountain. I've never really climbed a mountain that's icy, so I don't know whether that would be a positive or negative thing. So you need to think about that. So certainly that the juxtaposition there, the oxymorons of warm ice, if that's an oxymoron, is sort of it's yeah, it's an oxymoron. It's a strange juxtaposition because it's such a contrast. Okay, so we went through some of the things on the previous slide which might have acted to make the journey seem more hazardous, less positive, not easygoing. But there are so many positive images in this poem that make me think that the overall tone of the poem is very positive. So it might have been a difficult journey. It had ups and downs. Well, it had ups and pauses, but actually there are loads of images which are really positive. So old brogues, there's something dignified about brogues, and the fact that they're old, there's something sort of stable and well made implied about them. What you need to do with this, with the descriptions of some of these words, just make notes of about them in your anthology. The earth stained hand, I think, creates an idea of someone who's worked hard all through their life. There's a history there. There's a sense of longevity, that somebody's doing something good. It's manual labor. It's worthwhile, and it's had an impact. Give good purchase means something solid to hold on to. So metaphorically and literally, that's a really good thing. There's a stable foundation, so it might be holding you up physically, or it might be holding you up emotionally. And smooth and thick, there's something sort of comforting about that. It feels comforting and soft. The still firm shoulder is saying something about this man, this grandfather, that he might be old, but actually he's still fit and healthy, and able to do this holding up. And then the smiling mouth. So some of those things, where there was difficulties when you're climbing up the mountain, the smiling mouth is where you're reaching the summit. So actually you're reaching your objective, and the smiling mouth is welcoming, friendly and kind, and maybe even celebrating this achievement. And this whole experience seems to refresh. This experience of getting to know his grandfather refreshes him. The thick hair, it's the same as the smooth and thick beforehand. It's it's comforting and healthy seeming. It seems healthy. No, the association of clouds and birds seems to do with freedom, because they're in the sky, they're free, they're not constrained. And then the good heart beating through everything. That's the ultimate. At the core of it, the grandfather is a good person, and that this journey to get to know him was a worthwhile one. Through contact with his grandfather, the poet can lift himself up, someone said. I know not who, but that's a comment about the overall meaning behind the poem. But there are other things which say that we're going back to one of the previous slides, really, where the journey seems less secure, that you've got lines like trying to get a grip, that actually this well, I suppose like any worthwhile journey, it's not necessarily really easy. You've got to keep trying, you've got to keep persevering to get a hold of it. So there's still a sense of potential danger, and he does say, not looking down, for climbing has its dangers. So not looking down, seeing, not seeing where you've come from. So if this is about an emotional journey, maybe the poet is not feeling emotionally stable himself. He doesn't look back to see where he's come from. So he whatever has gone before is past. He doesn't want to go back to that. He wants to keep going up. And I suppose that whenever you strive for anything or you hope for something, there's always a danger of disappointment, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't strive for it, because there's a growth in striving for something anyway. I mentioned one of the earlier sound bites, that I think the poem is ultimately positive, and I do, but it is possible to have an alternative interpretation of it. You might not think so, and that's also fine, because some of the reasons that I think it's positive is it's saying pull myself up. So he's pulling himself up from somewhere where he was down. So if this is about his emotions, he is actually lifting himself out of those depths that he might have been in. He's reaching for the summit, so he's striving for something, and there's that sense of freedom in clouds and birds circle. But there's still a sense of an end, and you might not necessarily agree with what I'm about to say, but for me, when I read the line birds circle, which is in line 25, which I previously have said could be a symbol of freedom, Actually, the first thing that comes to my mind, this might say more about me than anything else, are vultures circling. So, and you could connect that with the idea that you're talking about climbing grandfathers, there's old, there's, a sense of, moving towards death. So that for me is something that's potentially negative. And there's also this idea of slow pulse. Now you could see slow pulse as, steady and healthy, but if it's too slow, it can be connected to a negative idea as well. And then when you think about that image of the mountain itself, yes, you've got all of the positive things such as strength and solidity, but it's also inhuman and it's inaccessible. Well, someone like me, it'd be inaccessible. I'm not going up any mountains anytime soon. Well, none of us are, frankly, but even when we can, I'm not going up one. So it's inaccessible to some people. So, it's accessible to some, but it's exclusive in that way. I suppose that's what I'm trying to say. So it's not necessarily completely positive. Okay, so we're nearing the end. We're on the last two slides, three slides. About structure. So should have done this at the beginning, maybe, because always going on about how important structure is and that you should always be writing about structure. It's quite easy to write about structure in this poem. I think there's sort of three key things that I would write about. One is the fact that you can't avoid it. It's written in a single stanza. Now you could say, does that indicate the shape of the mountain? It's not a particularly mountainous shape, but it's a solid single structure, like a mountain is a solid single structure. Or does the fact that it's one stanza suggest longevity of connection, or the longevity of this person's lifespan, the length of this person's lifespan? There's nothing breaking up the connection between the grandson and the grandfather. It's not broken up into stanzas or phases. It's one experience. Yeah. Okay. So, that's the first thing that I would say about that one single stanza. The next thing we could say about structure is that it's written in free verse. There's no rhyme scheme. So there's no, that's their sense of freedom. And I think that goes with that idea of not having a rope or a net to tie you down. So you're not tied down by having to make a rhyme in a particular place. So, almost, rhyme could be something that a poet clings on to, perhaps, or it could be something that restricts a poet if you want to see it that way. So I think the free verse echoes that idea of freedom or potential. There's a potential in the poem that's not restricted by a rhyme scheme, or a potential in the person that's not restricted by anything. And then also we might want to talk about end stopping. So the end stopping is really interesting. So there's end stopping in lines 1, 4, 12, 17 and 27. So there are interruptions, and I think that could reflect the journey up the mountain. So he might make stops in that journey, pauses in the journey. So it's not interrupted into stanzas, but there are pauses. So he might be stopping, catching his breath. Something might be a particularly difficult part of the journey, or particularly difficult part of the relationship, for example. But then as you get towards the end of the poem, there's end stopping on line 17, and then not, and again until line 27. So there's a 10-line gap there, which might reflect sort of growing confidence. So he doesn't have to keep stopping. He gets more momentum as he goes higher up the mountain. He wants to get to the end. He wants to realize his potential. He wants to gain the thing that he's been striving for. So I think that indicates confidence and speed, perhaps, and a desire to conquer. Conquer's the wrong word, because he's not wanting to conquer his grandfather, but you know what I mean. He wants to actually get to his end goal. Phew, final slide. Okay, so this is about line length, and if you look at the poem, the line length, although there's some variation, they're relatively similar. So there's not huge variation in terms of line length. And that could be an indicator of determination or confidence, or it could be an indication of the steady influence of his grandfather over time. So, you know, there are different things that you can say about that. It's certainly not, it doesn't seem like he's all over the place on this journey. You know, it's a steady journey from the bottom of the mountain up to the summit of the mountain, and there's not much variation there. The other thing that I haven't talked about, but you might want to have a look at is the enjambment, and then think about where it's enjambed and what that might indicate. Okay, if you got to the end of this, well done. And hopefully you've made some really good notes on your anthology. I will no doubt be setting that as one of our lessons so that you'll show me the notes that you've made. Okay, have a great day.